Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast. If you're listening as new episodes are released on the feed, this is March of 2020, and I've cut down my planned podcasting hiatus by a few weeks, but who am I kidding? I never really stopped during this break anyways. Well, as we record, we are in the midst of the global pandemic of COVID-19 virus or coronavirus or whatever you like to call it. It changes day to day what we're allowed to call it or not. But as history lovers, we know that this isn't the first or likely the last time a disease has affected our society. And today I'm joined by two past guests, Dr. Max Gulker and Dr. Phil Magness of AIER, the American Institute for Economics Research. And I didn't screw it up this time, as I have in previous times. And we're going to talk about a disease that flipped the world upside down and ushered in some huge changes, especially, but not limited to, the church, which was the Black Death. And we're going to go back in time to discuss some of the things of how that pandemic affected society and maybe some of the ways that we can relate those changes to today. So, Phil and Max, how are you guys doing?
Oh, holding up all right.
Yeah, we're getting by.
We're all sequestered, so this is a little bit of a new thing for all of us. Now, for those who haven't listened to our collaborations with Max on the Cadaver Synod and with Phil on the School of Salamanca, you should definitely go back and listen now. But before we go on, can you tell us more about yourselves and maybe the American Institute for Economic Research, and whoever wants to go, you guys can flip a coin.
Yeah. So Phil Magness, I am an economic historian based here at AIER, work in a variety of areas, mostly 19th and 20th century U.S. economic history and tax policy, although I've maintained a long-running interest in especially the medieval world and philosophy and its connection to the history of economic thought. Here at AIER, American Institute for Economic Research, we're an independent research institute that publishes a variety of educational commentary, scholarship, research, and data analytics on economics in the United States and general trends in the world.
Yeah, and I'm Max Gulker. I'm an economist and a senior research fellow also with AIER. My background is more in kind of empirical microeconomics. I these days write a lot about kind of policy, poverty on one side, and maybe some kind of solutions that people wouldn't normally think of to that, and a lot about technology also. And what I really love about technology is kind of looking at society and the way it changes and its beliefs change along with that. So that, I think, has a lot to do with kind of what's happened between then and now in the plague. And you know, we're happy to be here and really to get curious and get interested in this and have fun. And these are serious times, but these are part of the way we understand that, and we kind of open up our minds and engage. So we're really looking forward to this.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it because we're going to talk about the plague in broad strokes here. There's a lot of different places you can listen and read about the details, but I think we're going to get more into some of the social factors and some of the things that maybe the higher level things that we can talk about. That'll be a lot of fun. But I guess we should at least do a little primer on the Black Death. There was a pandemic that swept through Europe and Asia from 1347 to 1352. And like I said, there's a ton of great podcast episodes, books, documentaries on all the nitty gritty. But the short story to just get us rolling today is there's been tons of plagues. I mean, there's the plague of Athens that happened during the classical Greek period. There was the plague of Cyprian that happened during the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries that really highly affected the church. And then a big one, the plague of Justinian, which happened during late antiquity. And I mean, obviously many, many more. They were all very deadly and caused their own social upheaval. For example, like I was saying, the plague of Cyprian really helped Christianity greatly grow in the Roman Empire during that time period. Now, the Black Death of the mid-1300s, it was 3 related bacterial diseases that spread from Central Asia, and it was probably brought to Italy by Genoese sailors trading with the Mongols in the area of the north of the Black Sea region. These diseases were really bad news. The bubonic, the pneumonic, and the septicemic versions of the plague, they had internal bleedings. They would lead to black like lumps that maybe gave the plague its name. There's some debate about that, but the mortality rate was in the neighborhood of 50%, and up to into the 60%. And it usually had a really short course of disease. Within getting sick, most people were dead within a couple of days. And the other 2 forms, the pneumonic and the septicemic, they even had higher mortality rates, up to 100%, 99%. So in Europe, within these short span of years, the late 1340s and the early 1350s, 2/3 of the population in some places had died. So, and obviously it had much higher rates where there was higher densities of population. So the cities saw that 2/3 rate, where your country areas maybe, much less so. And I just, for me to try and picture that, so I have a family of 4, and within inside of 24 hours, 2 of them could be dead and another sick. I mean, that's insane. And in many places, all 4 people could be dead. I mean, easily enough. So half the people are just gone within days. And so, that's what we're really going to discuss today, is how does that affect a society as people, and logistically, economically, like just every aspect of society was affected, and what does that do to an individual's psyche and their social outlook? So we're going to discuss all of those issues today. But firstly, what was the situation of society and trade, like the 10,000-foot view in the early 1300s and in the middle 1300s, and what allowed the plague to spread so quickly and effectively at that time?
Yes, I can take that. The early 1300s are kind of referred to in some of the historical literature as the High Middle Ages. That's the peak of medieval culture. It's a period following about 200 years of a population boom that's taken place across Europe. And it's also a period of the reestablishment of trade routes that had not been common since basically the end of Antiquity, of movement across mostly the Eurasian continent, the Mediterranean area, as you mentioned, from the Black Sea. So the original point of contact of what they think where this plague came from is on the Crimean Peninsula. And it is Italian traders that are located there, engaged in just routine commerce that had really blossomed over the previous several decades, carrying it back to Genoa, Italy. At the same time, though, you're having major military events and upheavals, and that is coming from the Far East. That's the Mongolian Empire has undertaken a massive expansion across the continent. And one of the things that comes with that is the mass transmission of disease. We know this from antiquity up until the modern day. When armies move across continents, they often carry plagues and influenza and smallpox, whatever it happens to be of that era, with them. We know this from the earliest recorded instances in the ancient world to the American Civil War to World War I and World War II. Instances of disease transmission follow armies. Add on to that, they're weaponizing disease. Some of the Mongol armies realized that they could catapult the bodies of their dead across the city walls into the cities that they are besieging. And one of those happens to be in Crimea, where these Italian traders are picking up their goods, engaged in commerce. So you have an initial transmission that's probably linked to what we would consider germ warfare today, and ends up on a ship. A couple of weeks later, it is in a major commercial hub in Italy, and from there it just spreads across the continent.
Maybe I'll set the table a little bit of what was going on in the papacy at that point and in the church, that we're in the time period called the Avignon papacy, where the papacy and the church, the entire administration, had moved lock, stock, and barrel from Rome to a town in southern France called Avignon, which is it's near Marseille. It's but interestingly enough, in the feudal period back then, it wasn't in the Kingdom of France. It was actually in the Holy Roman Empire, because of not exactly the Holy Roman Empire, but, a person who was a vassal of this and of that. But so it really straddled the line between the papacy at that point and the church, between several major political powers, which made things very complicated for them. But in this period also, the papacy really was run in large aspect by the French king. And during the 1309 to 1376, when the papacy was in Avignon, every pope was a Frenchman, and most of the College of Cardinals at that point was French as well. It should also be mentioned that this is the period of the high watermark of the 100 Years' War, which made between England and France, which made things very interesting politically speaking. And just quickly, there was only one Pope, Clement VI, during that time, and he was very wealthy and an able administrator, and also a bit of a ladies' man, which played into the politics as well. During the worst of the plague, he spent most of the 3 months where it really racked Avignon, which it was pretty interesting when as you had said, Phil, that the plague had hit it came in through Italy. It spread to Avignon within a few weeks. So it shows how quickly and how much Avignon was a nexus of trade links, and how quickly those trade links moved. With people in Avignon, 2,000 people a day were dying, and eventually 2/3 of the population of the city would, as well as 2/3 of the College of Cardinals died during that time period. The Pope, this is just fun facts. He spent almost the entire of the worst part of the plague in between two raging bonfires. That was what his doctor suggested, which was probably not a bad precaution.
Ward off the
fleas, I guess,
fleas
right?
and rats
and people.
Yeah, people.
But the finest care medicine can buy, or the finest care money can buy.
That's like one side of it. And then the other side is that he was given a magical emerald ring, which if he faced east, I think it was, that warded off plague. And if you faced west, that warded off being poisoned. So, I mean, I guess the medical science there was still had some work to do.
Yes.
Well, I'm sure they thought he botched the response by not getting enough emerald rings for everybody, having them stockpiled and kind of ready to go. So. Actually, just a couple of observations maybe here. Is this a good time, Steve?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So first of all, I want to just bring out the fact that, what we're living through right now, which is extremely serious times, in which I think almost everybody would say this is, whatever curve you're tracing out here and whatnot, this is pretty unprecedented, what we're going through, how we're changing our lives. And this is nothing compared to, in terms of the rate of death, in terms of the understanding of what was going on, in terms of, the role of rumor versus communication. At the same time, there's a parallel here, which is, the story of kind of modernity in a way is a story of connection throughout the world, right? And even undoing that connection sometimes, like after the fall of the Roman Empire. And, like you said, the couple of hundred years before, we have all of this, renewed economic activity. We have another source of a lot of death, the Mongols, who are also a source of connection kind of coming through. And what do you know? We have this disease. And now, you see undertones of that in the way our kind of never before connected society and the sort of anxiety about that in terms of, politics with China, in terms of the way we're all kind of shouting at each other. And I would just put out there that it's hard sometimes to see the benefits of that kind of connection throughout the world, but they're staggeringly huge, and this is a problem that comes along with them sometimes. It doesn't mean we want a less connected world, I think.
Yeah.
I think the church had some interesting roles at this point. It really was, the church was how everybody connected to everything at that point. People with the sacraments and, attending church weekly. That was really, it impacted every aspect of their lives. But a lot of people at this point saw that they felt that this institution was failing them in some way. And that's where we get certain orders, mendicant traveling orders, like the flagellants, who would beat themselves with, I guess, a cat of nine tails. I guess they had different instruments for that, but they were really at odds with the institutional church, because the institutional church, or the hierarchy, they didn't like traveling ascetic preachers who weren't attached to the hierarchy. They weren't under a bishop. They weren't under a canon or anything like that. And these people, they were spreading disease, which I think even at that time, they had some idea that they were spreading disease. They were attacking different communities. And at this point, anti-Semitism in Europe, they had always been anti-Semitism, but this is when it gets really kicked into high gear. And previously, the church had use the anti-Semitism to their benefit, but the Jews were also the traders who were, bringing in a lot of this wealth that they were getting. And these orders or these people like the flagellants, they would come in and, cause pogroms and, massive attacks on Jews. We haven't seen anything quite like that yet where, anybody's turning on anybody. What do you think? Is this something that could happen at this point, or we just don't know? Let's, maybe we could play that out a little.
I think that that it's worth saying that in some ways this is interestingly almost a problem that's more modern in character than a lot of problems that we even think about 100 years ago. People compare this to a war. It's not like a war. And nor is what was going on in the 1300s. This is a problem that sort of emerges out of all of this contact and all of these individual decisions and being places. And then in this case, their relationship to all these pests that are around. And these are exactly the kind of problems you can't control. You can't project concentrated power. You can't project an army onto it. And so this sort of anxiety kind of comes up of what are we doing? Why is somebody not doing something? Because I think our intuition sometimes says we should be able to do more than we can. And so, today, I think you see a lot of that get played out in the political debate.
Sure.
The big difference today is that people really do trust the science behind, the germ theory of medicine and all of that. And I think that probably makes an uncalculable large difference. I don't know if you have anything, Phil.
Yes, times of plague and times of natural disaster generally, but really when we get into medical issues such as this, are characterized by a massive society-wide information problem. It's the unknown that stirs people into the frenzy. It's what causes them to seek out explanations for why this has been visited upon us. Because you think about what does a virus do? It almost indiscriminately can take out anyone. It doesn't matter if you're the king or the bishop or the cardinal or just the lowly peasant in the field. If you get hit with this thing, you are going to be in severe danger for your life, especially when we're talking about the Black Death with 50% or higher mortality rates that come out of it. The problem this creates is if you compare it to what they knew, what their world that they were coming from, this is a society that is very deeply steeped in religious tradition. The High Middle Ages, what do we associate that with? Historically, it's the Gothic architecture. It's the Notre Dame style cathedrals with there's these massive, beautiful edifices that pop up across Europe in a period of about 300 years between 1000 and the mid 1300s. That these massive cathedral projects are undertaken. Some economic estimates say that as much as maybe a fifth to a quarter of the entire GDP of Europe is put into cathedral building in this period. And this coincides with the way that you show your devotion to God. You attain your salvation by contributing to the building of these honorific structures across society. Then all of a sudden a plague comes along and it's indiscriminate. People are dying left and right. It doesn't seem to matter if you did your work on building the cathedral, you were a good practicing Christian, or you were a drunkard or a lout that was eschewing their obligations to the church. And this is like an epistemic disruption for how people understand society. Throw on top of that previous instances of plagues that had hit Europe, and especially the mythology, the hagiography that emerges around how they were dealt with. One referential event that they keep going back to in documents is St. Gregory the Great, who's Pope in the 6th century. He takes over. He's a plague pope. His predecessor dies, and he's thrust into the papacy. Ends up becoming one of the great formative figures that sets the church onto its modern footing. One of the first true bishops of Rome that exercises power beyond the immediate region around him, and really starts to shun off some of the old Roman Empire and the Eastern Empire in particular as the political authority of Central Europe. So what happens under St. Gregory? He comes to power in 590, and Rome is being swept by one of the many plagues of that era. They don't know exactly what, but it's probably a derivative of the earlier plague of Justinian. Part of the legend that emerges around St. Gregory is upon being elected, he leads a procession through the streets of Rome to show as a religious devotion to ward off the plague. And we don't know too much in terms of the records of how this proceeded other than it occurred. But in the almost a millennium between then, a hagiography emerges around Gregory where it becomes a statement of faith. The thought is that the Pope, by leading this procession, he approaches where the Vatican is today. If you're familiar with Rome, there's a massive structure there. It's the Castle San Angelo, which was Hadrian's old tomb from Antiquity that they had repurposed. And the legend says that St. Michael the Archangel appears on the roof of Hadrian's mausoleum, the Castle San Angelo, you can see where the name comes from, and sheathes his sword. St. Michael's always depicted holding a sword to the sky. He sheathes his sword, and the plague dissipates because the Pope has demonstrated a profession of faith, and Rome is therefore saved. So this is the legend.
And why couldn't Clement do that?
Exactly. So they're seeing these both religious and temporal authorities that by this time has been blended, and everyone is versed in this legend that's been expanded and exaggerated over almost 1,000 years of a miracle being performed to save the city, and yet the reality is the institution is not up to snuff. They don't really know what's going on here. Everything that they previously had confidence in has just descended into chaos.
That's what the trust in institutions. There was obviously a much bigger fall in trust of institutions back then when you have, so many people dying. But even today, there was the governor of New York was on and the radio and complaining that people in New York City were still going and playing basketball and hanging out in the park. And so there's obviously a disconnect even today with when everybody's supposed to be more or less, if you're not staying inside, you should be several feet away from somebody else. What happens when people, are they ignoring institutions at this point, or is it a trust issue?
Well, I think the institutional response that you see as the papacy actually does start to adapt to this very, very quickly. So one of the things that Clement does is he basically absolves victims of the plague of their sins, does a mass absolution, and tries to put the message out there that even though you are succumbing to this disease, you are right with the Lord because I have absolved you. So the institution itself is adjusting in that sense. He also finds, and there's some evidence that this is an origin point to, because we know the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance are considered the period of high corruption, nepotism in the papacy. It's popes that are appointing their cousins and their nephews and kids of various relatives and families to high positions of authority in the church. Well, I think, as you already mentioned, this disease wipes out the College of Cardinals. They have a massive gap in institutional knowledge that's basically obliterated overnight of positions that were usually handed over to figures of seniority. So what does Clement do? He has to scramble to refill the College of Cardinals. And one of the things he does is he starts appointing all of his nephews and children of various relatives and of various political families that had connection in there. So you were getting cardinals named at, I think the youngest was at the age of 18, that turned out to be one of his nephews, becomes the future pope. A few generations later, I guess he had a head start because he's a cardinal from age 18 onward. So it's like this institutional response just for the lack of manpower to even keep the College of Cardinals active and able to fulfill its role, opens up the door to this practice of starting to hand out positions of authority based on who your family happens to be.
I think that it's in the idea of trust in institutions today, and that's being talked about a lot. And I think we're at a moment, we happen to be at a moment when this has come along, of kind of a low point of trust in institutions, at least kind of locally speaking. In the last couple of generations already. And I think there's an assumption, and a lot of the time people talk about this, that we need to start trusting our institutions again. I think what's really going on is that we have seen really rapid technological change again, just what we're sitting here doing and what we're going to do with it right now, being one example. Technology, culture, and let's call it social orders, governance institutions all feed back on each other. And I think a couple of them might have gotten ahead of our governance institutions a little bit. And I think this might be a moment where we're seeing a lot of tension between all of those things, and that there's really not a solution to that other than to experience that tension and learn the way that we all kind of do when we that's kind of in a much more profound way than somebody kind of from the top writing it down or whatnot can do. And so that if there's a lack of trust in institutions, right, I think that can be messy and painful in the moment. I think we might be in a moment where there's medium to long-term benefits in that kind of evolutionary process.
Yeah, there's a couple other things that the church did that maybe broke down what people, their expectations and their trust in the church. Like, for example, when they were giving communion at the church, the priest would give it out on a really long stick to stay as far away from people as possible. So it's, obviously that's showing that there's a certain lack of trust and that there's, maybe that the priests aren't fulfilling their obligations in in a straight manner, if you will. And then they also, when people were dying, they would poke a hole either in the door or stick the holy oil that they would use to anoint people on when they died through a long stick. So those were things that, broke down a lot of trust in that institution. But what's interesting is that Christian piety went through the roof at this time. And this was one of the things that, up until this point, I think it was Kevin Madigan, who's a church scholar. He said that Europe really wasn't fully Christianized until the 14th, the 14th, 15th century, that it seeped into all aspects of the culture, especially in places like Northern Europe, which, if you think about it, certain parts of Northern Europe didn't really Christianize until the 11th century. So that, they hadn't been soaking in that as long as maybe like Italy and Spain were, that they had been basically since day one of Christianity. Maybe we can talk a little bit about, at this point, maybe change focus a little bit into the economics of that time period and how that, and the politics and how that played into, spreading the plague, but also in this time period where half of the people are gone. What does that do to labor markets, to goods and services, to all those things? So maybe, first off, just, talk about how it would affect people and the labor market, maybe how people were before the plague and what that just a couple of short years would do to how people interacted in the economy.
Yeah. So 1346, your situation in Europe is a fast and booming population. Land is becoming increasingly scarce. It's occupied by peasants under feudal lords. Labor is abundant everywhere. 1349, 2-3 years later, population is devastated. It's wiped out. It's over the course of a few years, essentially halved. You've got a massive labor shortage on your hand. You have more land than what the typical lord knows what to do with. And the workforce is basically half of what they were used to just a few years prior. This is instantaneously going to be an economic disruption. What do we know happens if there's a shortage of labor? Well, that pushes wages up. It's basically a shock to the supply of labor that's taken place. Wages on a market system would naturally go up, and laborers across Europe, those who survived the plague, began to demand higher and higher wages. So you've got this immediate effect. The political class sees this disruption, and we see this in France, we see this in England, and countries all across Europe, where the nobility, the lords, and the kings effectively attempt to pass decrees to restore the old order, the old economic order that existed in 1346 before everything was just thrown into turmoil. And part of these decrees are attempts at what we would call today price controls. An execution of an act by the state that says prices are fixed by the crown, or prices are fixed by the parliament or the noble lords in convention to attempt to reestablish the old economic order. Part of these price controls essentially transmitted into caps on wages. So you have an artificial cap on wages at a time when there's an upward pressure on wages caused by this shock to the labor supply.
These peasants were price gouging in a time of disaster. Yeah. How could they possibly do that?
And isn't that pretty much what the nobles thought they were doing, is price gouging without using that vocabulary?
They probably felt victimized by that. Yeah. I asked people that once a couple of weeks ago, and some people got really mad at me. So, if workers should be demanding more money to produce, hand sanitizer and stuff like that, but
it's the peasant price gougers.
Exactly.
That's our study of the Middle Ages.
Yeah. I think that in general. I think one really important point here is zoom out a little bit on the world here. And I'm used to thinking of, I think a lot of people are, the first half of the 20th century is kind of the most traumatizing period in human history, between two world wars, the Spanish flu. look at what you got going on in a few years here. There's the plague. There's going east, these Mongol conquests that have happened, over a couple of generations that are, by any standards, a genocide. In addition to sort of changing the world in ways that now we can look back and say, oh, well, that's, the modern world. You've got crusades that have just happened in the world. You've got this is a population that has been exposed to several things that are, even in this moment, that's sort of unprecedented beyond our comprehension, really. And it's that. It's not like they were going and seeing shrinks,
right?
Then maybe this, maybe that's part of the piety. And it's interesting that the most radical question they could ask is the Catholic Church the right way to connect to this, Holy Trinity, rather than is this Holy Trinity the right thing? And that's actually a really interesting question too. But the events that have rocked the world in this place in this time, it just occurred to me, really do stack up, I think, and give the early 20th century a run for its money in a way. I would be curious, and I'm not sure. Maybe I think probably Phil knows this. In terms of the economics, so you have this leveling that happens, obviously, and kind of, trying not to be cold about it, but often, whether biology, economics, whatever, after a mass extinction event, you have this rapid growth and change. And what happened in the, in the decades after this?
Yeah. Well, I think you've got multiple effects that are playing out. First, as the result of these effective price control attempts. The most famous one, I think, comes out of England in 1349. They basically pass a laborer's code to attempt to hold wages constant and hold trading prices fairly constant relative to the pre-plague levels. And over the next half to 3/4 of a century, continued iterations of this code keep coming in and keep being invoked over and over again, often to a point of unintentional economic stagnation. Throw another layer of complexity on top of this, the depopulation of Europe, and that's effectively what it is. You're cutting the demography that existed in 1346 to, I think most of the estimates say it's about where Europe was in the mid 11th century. So you've basically cut off about 250 years worth of demographic growth overnight. What is that going to do to economic relationships between wealth, between the value of money? We're operating at a time when the money supply is mostly determined by precious metals that are held in various estates. It's not really growing at a very rapid pace. There's no influx of new cash from the New World, hasn't been discovered yet. Trade is also shut down. So there's a fairly stagnant money supply, but now you have half the population. Mm. So what's this do to purchasing power?
Wow. Yeah, it is uncomfortable questions, and possibly. Right.
Now, obviously, we're never going to have, or I mean, at least knock on wood, we're not going to have the kind of death, depopulation that they did during the Black Death. But now, as then, with this slowdown in economic growth, and, today they're doing, did they just throw another trillion into the pot today? I mean, they're throwing around trillions. Like nothing.
The stimulus package. Yeah. The medieval stimulus package.
Yeah.
Did they just, after the Black Death, have to ride it out and see what happened? I mean, obviously you say that they weren't, they were trying to do some policies to fix it with these price controls, which actually didn't fix it. What were some of the other policies that maybe governments did to try and fix the economy, so to speak?
Well, a lot of it's just ad hoc of where the plague happened to hit. And we don't have too much in the terms of data from this period. It's very poorly recorded. A lot of it's conjecture. There aren't many censuses. There are a few birth and death records recorded by churches, bits and pieces of anecdotes. But one of the real problems is the way that history was written down in this era is it's a storytelling approach. It's a minstrel. It's a scribe telling a tale of the plague that swept through town, which tends to be very fictionalized and very exaggerated. What we do know from evidence is different cities on how they responded to the plague hitting them, or if they were unfortunate enough to be swept by one that were just a few decades earlier kind of rival economic powers, they start to diverge. So the classic example is in northern Italy today, the Tuscan cities of Florence and Siena, which were the historical rivals of each other. They emerge as basically city-states in the 11 and 1200s. This is where all the fun of Italian politics in that era has taken place. They're both initially banking hubs as well. And a lot of the thought is that Siena takes a much heavier hit from plague infestation in that era than Florence. It's just they're just up the road from each other. What started as two relatively similarly sized cities, one starts to stagnate after the plague and just goes into a very tepid period, a very prolonged, slow decline, whereas the Florentine Republic becomes the new center of banking for Italy in that era, and in some ways is thought to jumpstart the Renaissance. So it could be just the luck of the draw of when and where the plague hit and how devastating it happened to be that sets the trajectory of what the city does next. You do see evidence of modern banking emerging, at least in the century or so after the first infestations of the plague. That's where we start to see really an inward turn to cities themselves being the commercial hubs. It's almost a decentralization of power away from broader kingdoms towards smaller city states in that era, and that's where you get I don't know if I'd call that an economic recovery, but it's definitely an economic aftermath within the next century.
Yeah.
Since we have two economists here, we might as well talk about what's going on today. We're only about a week into in the U.S. I mean, as surprising as that is, and I know I have a lot of questions about the economics of it. What are we looking at today as far as economics, and what might we look at, especially given that we've gone through things of similar episodes? What do you think we're looking at maybe in the next 3 months or 6 months as how all of this plays out?
I think the first important thing to say here, to us, to your audience, to everybody, is we are a week into this, right?
Yeah.
And it is worth remembering. And, it's almost like, the Roman emperor who had like the slave during the triumph saying, you're just a person. Like, I want someone following me around being like, we're only a week into this. We're only a week into this. So there is a colossal amount of uncertainty here. At the same time, we do, we know things about how this works. Another bit of perspective that I think it's important for people to have is, forget medieval history. Imagine if this had happened in 1990. We would have been stuck at home with a few TV channels, a landline phone, and a radio. And in addition to that, just sucking in general compared to the amount of, exactly. But the amount of work that would have been lost. My guess, and this is nothing more than a gut kind of reaction, is you'd be dealing with economic losses 30 years ago from this several times, like multiple times larger than this. If this is relatively fast, and people expect it to be relatively fast, there's thinking in macroeconomics that would suggest, okay, people are just going to kind of defer some of that activity. I don't think that leaders, the media, just really even the media as it's constituted, now can't do this, have really kind of coordinated expectations in that kind of way. And I think people are very worried. There is
the uncertainty again.
Exactly. So it's easy to see the comparison on a much larger time scale to the environmental stuff. That's a complex system that we don't really fully ever able to understand or forecast or control. It leaves a lot of ambiguity. and we're all going to bring what we bring in with us to that ambiguity. And so it's not, we shouldn't be surprised when these debates happen along our political lines. The only thing that would be better if we could do it is if we could take all of these different opinions as kind of noisy signals, as they like to say, and say, maybe, I have an opinion and here's an opinion, and maybe that gives me a little more information about what the truth is. That's a hard thing for people to do, obviously. There aren't easy answers to this. There are going to be economic losses. We are not typically people who are in favor of a lot of kind of, what we would call a Keynesian stimulus. Governments are going to do that right now because that's what people expect them to do. And the downside personally to those politicians of doing nothing is enormously worse than the downside of, quote, doing something. And so, and so we do have, it's in a society like this. And when we have robust debate, when we all have voices now, which we focus on the bad of that a lot, but I tend to think a lot of that debate that looks very messy is healthy, is sort of how we interact and arrive at decisions now. And it's a little new and it looks a little different. So the macroeconomic losses for this are going to be significant. It's hard to know whether you're dealing with like a 2008 or, two times a 2008 or, a .com that's kind of actually maybe a good thing no, it won't be that. But I try to kind of advise people sometimes no sudden movements right now. Like it's
no panic.
I guess it's funny. It like maybe like the worst times personally for me in my life. I've always had this thought of like, well, in a couple of weeks, this is going to be different. And who knows if it's different good or different bad, but it's going to be different. And it's funny. I kind of tweeted something like that the other day and people really liked it. Yeah. Like it really kind of somehow worked for that. Like, even if it's worse, it's going to be different in some way we don't know. And that's kind of the Max Gulker macroeconomic forecasting answer you get with me is kind of, is this kind of like, isn't it beautiful how we don't know? But these are real hard trade-offs. And these are trade-offs involving economic losses versus transmission of a disease in people's lives and older people's lives, more vulnerable people's lives. Something in terms of healthcare, I like to, a policy that I've thought about before is, there's perspective of that it's been less than 200 years where human beings really ever had to make a choice between I can live longer by spending these economic resources. Medicine just didn't deliver the goods before that, really, to really do that with any kind of degree of regularity. And I don't think, I think sometimes that what culture does over generations is it kind of figures out kind of the parameters of those things and how to approach them in a comfortable way. And we're nowhere near comfortable with those kinds of things. And you see it in the fact that we gravitate to healthcare systems where we never have to think about how much we pay, whether they're single payer, whether they're insurance based. I think a lot of the discomfort here, it kind of involves that too, is we don't have a good way. We don't have a comfortable way of wrapping our minds around that. And, again, this may be part of the process of us learning how to do that. And that's not fun while we're in it. That's difficult. And we have to watch and know that the amount of it. Look at the amount we have to talk about a week into this. Mm-hmm. It's if we come back and do this 2 weeks from now, we're going to have to block out like a hardcore history size chunk of like podcast. So yeah,
and that's
about all I got.
Yeah,
kind of interesting, and it ties into some of the work that you've done, Max, where in Italy, they're kind of making these decisions already. I don't know how accurate all of the information that's coming in, where they are deciding that there's not enough of these ICU beds and facilities. So they're deciding that maybe certain people at above certain ages and other factors won't be getting the health care that maybe other people will get. And that's something that it hasn't even come onto the plate yet in the U.S., but certainly could if things progress the way they did, say, in Italy, or the way they're looking to be progressing in maybe Spain and other countries.
Well, that's we may face one of the problems we may really face here that seems to, like, when you really ask people that you can get some consensus on, is that just the infrastructure of our healthcare system is not quite big enough to take all of this at once. And, honestly, you don't want it to be big enough to do that, because then you're spending all of a society's resources being ready for this, once or twice in a century event. And so what you actually want to do as an economist is to have as little regulated. People think it sounds like something that can be planned very more efficiently. It's almost always not. Right. And you want to leave a lot of flexibility for an economy to churn out this stuff. At the same time, there's so many issues I completely lost my train of thought. That's good enough.
I just throw into that to beware of the planners and anyone that claims to have an absolute answer to this. And I'd say this across the board, whether people are more panicked or more skeptical of what's going on. We really don't know. Our data is nowhere near the level that some of the pretensions of knowledge that are being put forth to make very strong claims on it are. And, I was talking with Max last night about this. One of the points that came up, this is a very fearful situation. And in some sense, many people are more fearful of the uncertainty of the situation than they would be of the catastrophic panic death model where 20 million people die, because that provides them more certainty, even though it's doom and gloom, than going into the unknown. Yeah. So this is just a recurring problem in history. But when we're facing what's fundamentally a knowledge issue, we don't have access to the knowledge that would allow us to even make projections. So what does this do? It cautions me against very bold policy moves, very proactive attempts of the government to manage it, because a lot of times they're just flying by the seat of their pants as well, making it up ad hoc. And,
I remember what I was going to say. In thinking about Italy making these kind of wrenching decisions about who gets, and they may well be in a situation now where they just have to do that. Yeah. But, when we talk about those decisions, think about being the person who has to make those decisions. And, I don't want to do that. That's way above my pay grade. Those decisions are best made on an imperceptible level by us all kind of interacting and figuring it out and making mistakes and learning and doing that over years. And that's where you get to a place. It's not that narrative minstrel story, right? Yes. that gives you history, but that is increasingly, as we're more and more connected, the way it works. And so, I think that we see the messiness is hard to turn away from and say, well, we're all going to learn from this in a couple of decades. And it's true. That involves an enormous amount of tragedy, and you don't want to yada yada that away. But this is, the more people are able to kind of make these choices, the messier it gets, but I think in the end, the more robust it gets also. You make these choices for themselves, rather than
society at large.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting, maybe the parallel of that in their society in the 14th century, that, their population had maybe expanded into areas that, they were maybe more connected to the land, so to speak, that, there was only so much food that they could produce, and they were really much more linked to their food chain than we are, directly, where if they had 100 more people in their village after, 50 years, that they would have to grow more crops on more land. They didn't have an ability to raise the production of the land that they were already tilling. Do you think there's any comparison today that maybe this is going to cause some sort of creative destruction of, it will change some of maybe the way healthcare is done, or the way, we've seen it already that like you were saying, that in the 90s, you couldn't have food delivered from any restaurant you can think of to your house, and you couldn't get on an app and, where you could virtually have no face-to-face communication with anybody and have your basic supply needs met. I guess there was a lot in that question, but
sure. Yeah. Start with that.
Well, I think we're seeing both of that playing out right now. So on the plus side, just in the last week of the very first week of this crisis being in place, we've actually seen some very proactive steps to remove regulatory hurdles and barriers to mitigating it. And this is everything from relaxing the FDA's control over approving new tests for the coronavirus because they need to expedite it, to even just things like quality of life. So several governors have suspended regulations on how liquor and alcohol can be delivered with food through delivery services, where previously you couldn't do that. Now they're saying, let's relax that regulation. Of course, I asked the question, why was that regulation ever in place to begin with? But we do see some positive effects from that. Where I do get worried is this is a pattern across history. Crisis moments are often really bad for unscrupulous politicians trying to hijack them. And we've seen this on both the left and right in the last week. Elizabeth Warren announced her whole plan that any economic stimulus package connected to alleviating this, and I'm not taking a stance of for or against that type of a package, but what she's saying is she wants to attach all these stipulations where companies also now have to pay a $15 minimum wage, and now have to have worker shareholders on the board. So it's like taking her old political platform and trying to hijack the crisis and shoehorn it into it. But we also see it on the right. I think Max just wrote a piece the other day. Pete Navarro, I don't know if you want to tell him about what he's up to.
There's this sort of economic contingency of one in the world. That's Peter Navarro, who's a neo-mercantilist, that basically, this is the school of thought with the precious metals Phil was talking about, that sort of used to say, we're kind of pretty maxed out on the wealth in the world, so now every sovereign, every country has got to just go race and get it. And that was basically debunked in the first paragraph of The Wealth of Nations in 1776. That's kind of, I think I called it modern economics origin myth, but it basically, there's truth to that. And you've seen him come out and say, well, we can't depend on China for our medicine. We have to increase our capacity, and then we have to increase demand for that capacity, and it becomes this very circular thing. And again, you can't tell a story start to finish that gives you comfort but the world trusting and being open and trading with each other. And to me, this is the issue that can sort of unite a lot of us that are sort of maybe on kind of like, I don't know, the left and right, but kind of the more socialist libertarian kind of access and things like that is trade is both this bottom-up economic process, and it involves openness and, cultural, inclusion and understanding. And that's the kind of stuff I don't want to walk away from here. I think in the end, we are in a really dangerous moment in terms of politically what can happen. I think we're also in the hardest moment maybe in human history for these power grabs to happen. Doesn't mean they can't, but people have never had voices like we do now, like we do literally right now. And a lot of this contentious debate and, people saying, oh, this is power grab, and then they're saying, oh, these people just, don't trust the government. And I think that is actually that, again, that kind of layer of robustness. I mean, we'll see. We will. And one of the interesting things about this issue is we are going to kind of see what happens in the next few months. And it is going to, a lot of these things unfold over generations and give people enough time to come up with whatever narrative they want that really they're even more right than what they were before. We're going to see, and we're going to learn a lot. And I hope we all just kind of keep talking and keep thinking about it and keep taking a breath and trying to understand each other. That's about the best we can do.
Yeah. I was talking to a family member who was maybe inclined towards that position, and I brought out the Bastiat. I can never remember the quote exactly, but where borders where goods won't cross, armies certainly will. And I think that people aren't thinking about that at this point. But if things progress, I mean, who knows where things will go from here? Because we really are on like the front end of the tsunami, and where it lands is going to be we'll not know for a while.
But we are watching, and we are. If you think back to the 1300s, and there were these little rumors circulating of people dying, and people, and all of a sudden people in your town started dying, and it's fun. One of the little kind of things I was listening to last night in preparation for this, it kept talking about the leadership in the Middle Ages like they were well, they should have been prepared for this.
Right.
Like, what on earth does that mean in 1300 something to be prepared for this?
And they thought they were prepared because they had been building all these cathedrals.
Right, exactly. They're going to like Gregory. They'll go and they'll lead a march, and the archangel will come, and the ring and the bonfires, and there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely true that no matter, if it's cavemen or it's us or probably our, children and our, ancestors 1,000 years from now, they're going to be wondering why you weren't prepared for the thing you didn't know was going to happen.
Oh, yeah. But you can always come up with things a week later that, everybody should have seen coming, and you can do that for any bad situation, basically. I'm not defending anybody by saying that, but sometimes I think the narrative should be more the limitations of what anybody in that role can do rather than what this person didn't do or that person didn't do.
And I would say, now you can correct me, Phil, in the 13th and in that Middle Ages periods, were people more relying on the church to be the actor and the change? Were they reliant so much that the king was going to do something, or even their duke, or whoever was running their little village or town was going to be the one who was going to do something, so to speak?
I think it's intermixed. We're thinking of an era where relationship to what we would consider the modern nation state is basically non-existent. Instead, you have much more localized nobility figures that are seen as basically the lord of the serfs, those who are under their care. So it's almost a paternalistic relationship. You work for the local lord, he pays you your wage, he gives you food, gives you shelter, you can go into his castle when an army attacks, all that kind of thing is part and package with the deal. But it's a much more localized economy. There's not nearly as much movement around, and it's really the breaking down of that movement by the intermediaries, the merchants, that really transform economic relationships, and then politics does seem to follow after that.
I think that this is probably, I think we're in a good spot because we could probably talk about 6 hours here. And I think like you were both saying that we could definitely talk in 2 weeks from now and, have a lot different discussion. Is there something that maybe something in the research that you've done or what you've looked that as we stand right now would be an interesting parallel, from where we stand right now, to kind of leave us thinking with?
Yeah. So the one thing I keep going back to is you mentioned Frederick Bastiat. It's the French economist in the 19th century, and a very skilled, insightful writer. But one of the themes that keeps coming up in his work is to pay attention to the unseen, to think about that which is not immediately evident to you. And if I had to offer one critique of the commentary that's been circulating around the current coronavirus discussion, is there's a lot of attention being paid to what is seen. A lot of attention being paid to, we get every single number update that comes out of Italy or any other country is instant news. And that's seen as a perception of what's coming. But we also have to be mindful of asking the question, what else is happening that we aren't accounting for and that we cannot account for just for lack of information? And this includes everything from do we start asking cost-benefit style equations? Because, if you have a prolonged economic shutdown that lasts 9 months or a year, that starts to have its own consequences that are not being considered very much right now. People get depressed. Suicide rates go up in times of recession and depression. So do deferred medical treatments on, say, like a more long-term disease like cancer. So we have clear evidence that this does start to take its toll in the long run. But we don't have a very clear path of understanding how that's going to play out.
I'll just leave you two historians with a little bit of perspective here that all of this that we're writing, we're recording right now, none of this is history. This is all primary sources one day.
Yeah, there we go.
Somebody's going to look back at. So
just as the monk scribes of the 14th century.
That's us, man. So deep breath, people.
There we go.
We will get through this. We don't know exactly how. We don't know what it looks like. Yeah. Let's just deep breath.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could probably talk again in 2 or 3 weeks' time and be able to say everything that we had talked about wrong today.
Yeah, sure. We'd be happy to do it, Steve.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much for coming on, and we should definitely do this again. And we'll probably have a little bit of time on our hands, too, in the next couple of weeks. So.
Yeah,
possibly.
Exactly.
Yep.
Well, thanks again, and we'll definitely talk again soon.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Take care.